The legend of Spartacus, the gladiator who defied Rome. Imagine for a moment the vast Roman Empire, at its peak, filled with power, wealth, and pride. No one dares to challenge it. No one dares to question it. But in the darkness of a prison, far from the grandeur of the imperial city, a man with an unquenchable fire in his gut would forge his destiny. This man was Spartacus, a gladiator whose existence forever changed the history of Rome, and with it, the very concept of the fight for freedom. But who was Spartacus really? What made him so different from the other men who also suffered under the Roman yoke? Why does his name still resonate to this day? Spartacus was not just a warrior, nor just another slave. He was a leader, a man capable of seeing beyond his own life, capable of transforming oppression into revolution. Today we will discover how a man who started as a slave ended up facing the Roman Empire itself, and how his fight echoes through the centuries. Before we dive into one of the most impactful stories of ancient Rome, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and activate notifications. Only then can you join us for more stories about great heroes, rebellions that changed the world, and the lessons we can learn from the past. If you're ready to discover how one man changed the fate of an empire, stay with us until the end. I guarantee that this story will make you see the history of Rome in a completely different way. The beginning of it all. Spartacus was born in Thrace, in a region that today forms part of the territories of Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. From a very young age, he witnessed the injustices that plagued his homeland. He was not an ordinary man, but a warrior, one of the thousands who, despite living in a world full of violence and poverty, still dreamed of something greater than mere survival. However, it was on the battlefield, under the banner of the Roman Empire, where Spartacus found his destiny. They enlisted as a legionary, a warrior who fought not for ideals, but for survival. It was there, in the ranks of Rome, where Spartacus learned what it means to be part of an unstoppable machine, but also what it means to lose your humanity in the middle of that machine. It was during his time as a Roman soldier when he began to understand this true power of Rome and its terrible methods of controlling the peoples it conquered. But what happens when a man realizes that he has nothing left to lose? Spartacus did not just decide to leave Rome, he decided to fight against it. He deserted, and as punishment was captured, chained, and eventually sold into slavery. The same empire that had trained him to be a warrior now saw him as mere merchandise, an object with no will of his own, reduced to servitude. The Gladiator school. His fate as a slave led him to a gladiator school in Capua, one of the most famous cities of ancient Italy. It was in the Gladiator school, in Capua, where Spartacus began to transform his fate, training not only to survive, but to fight for his freedom. There in the darkness of the cells, alongside other chained men, the spark of what would become one of the greatest and most feared rebellions in Roman history was formed. It was not the arena nor the cheers of the crowd that Spartacus desired. The hunger for freedom. The hunger for freedom was what drove him to train, to fight, to prepare for something bigger than the fight for survival. The gladiators, trained to fight, were not just slaves. They were men whose value was measured in their skill in the arena, in their ability to face danger and survive. Spartacus, however, did not fight to die for the pleasure of others. He fought for his freedom, for the right to live on his own terms. The rebellion, the story of Spartacus, is not simply about a runaway. It was much more than that. In 73 BC, Spartacus and other gladiators escaped from the school in Capua, sparking a rebellion that would change the history of Rome. But how could a small group of slaves and gladiators challenge an entire empire? The answer lies in the heart of Spartacus, his unbreakable will, his leadership ability, and his knowledge of the enemy. They were not just armed men, they were men with a cause. The escape was not the end, but the beginning of an open war against Rome. During their flight, Spartacus and his men took a long and dangerous path, but it was not in vain. In their first victories, they managed to seize weapons, horses, and supplies from the Roman troops that were pursuing them, while the number of those joining their cause grew. At first, peasants, workers, and other slaves fleeing oppression joined the rebellion. With each victory, Spartacus's power grew stronger. The number of Spartacus's followers rapidly grew. In no time, the 74 gladiators who had escaped became an army of over a hundred. Among them, there were not only gladiators, but also warriors, peasants, former Roman soldiers, and men from various regions of the empire, who, fed up with the oppression, joined the fight. At first, Rome did not see the magnitude of what was happening, believing it to be just a small uprising that would soon be crushed. Rome was wrong. Spartacus, with his skill and cunning, defeated the Romans again and again, using guerrilla tactics that made it impossible to capture him. While Rome sent entire legions to crush him, Spartacus and his army moved swiftly, striking where they least expected, disappearing before the enemy could respond. Roman disobedience. With each victory, the legend of Spartacus spread beyond Italy. His army was not only made up of men fighting for freedom, but also of those who believed that the dream of justice was not just a utopia. But like any great rebellion, the price of freedom is always high. Rome would not sit idly by in the face of this threat. In the Senate, news of Spartacus's victories caused alarm. The empire began to fear, and rightly so. The threat was no longer just from a few slaves. It was a real army, armed and trained, that had humiliated Rome's best troops. But Roman arrogance did not allow them to see what was happening. They thought Spartacus was just a momentary threat, and underestimated the magnitude of his rebellion. Rome made a grave mistake. Why? Because, like in many great stories of rebellion, it was not the number of men that determined the outcome, but the determination, unity, and vision of a leader. Spartacus had a clear mission, not just to fight, but to win. Not just to escape, but to conquer. And the story of his fight was being written with every battle won. The final challenge. What followed was an unstoppable war, a confrontation between oppression and the unquenchable desire for freedom. Spartacus, with his men, continued to demonstrate that the forces of Rome, though powerful, were not invincible, but time and strategy were his greatest enemy. Despite the victories, Spartacus knew that his forces could not hold out much longer against the military power of Rome. It was one man against an empire. Rome was no longer a distant empire, an oppressive structure far removed from Spartacus's dreams of freedom. Now Rome was his immediate enemy, his final goal, the empire that had managed to forge an invincible war machine, or at least that's what they thought. Spartacus, as a strategist with a clear vision, knew that to defeat Rome, he could not face it directly in open field. His men, although numerous, were inexperienced and lacked the formations, discipline, and training of the Roman legions. What Spartacus had was something more powerful: mobility, cunning, and courage. He knew that his army could not face the Roman legions in a conventional battle, so he resorted to guerrilla tactics. Attack and disappear. Instead of engaging in a direct confrontation, Spartacus chose to surprise his enemies, attack at the right moment when the Roman forces were not expecting him, and then quickly disappear into the vastness of the Italian countryside. The nature of his fight was not only physical, it was also psychological. Spartacus's genius lay in the way he manipulated war itself. The Romans faced an enemy they could not track, an enemy who understood their own weaknesses and exploited them mercilessly. With each victory, the small rebel army gained more followers, slaves, peasants, men who once lived under the yoke of Rome, but who now dreamed of the same freedom that Spartacus had awakened in their hearts. The dream of a world free from oppression was bigger than any victory, and they fought not just to survive, but for a future where justice would be the rule, not the exception. But as his army expanded, Rome remained an unstoppable war machine, and Spartacus knew he could only gain time, not a definitive victory. The inevitable approached on the horizon. The Roman legions, known for their iron discipline and formidable strength, would eventually be forced to face Spartacus. Could the gladiator who had humiliated Rome so many times achieve his final great victory, despite the unity Spartacus had managed to forge among the men under his command? Tensions began to arise. As the rebellion grew, differences emerged among the leaders, leading to disagreements over the way forward. Loyalty was tested. Some of the rebel leaders, like Crassus, began to question Spartacus's decisions, mainly regarding the strategy to pursue. While Spartacus dreamed of returning to his homeland, to his Thrace, where freedom called him, Crassus and other followers of the rebellion wanted more. They wanted total victory, a war that didn't just involve fleeing Rome, but that directly challenged the empire. The tensions reached a critical point. Spartacus's rebellion was no longer just a fight for freedom. It had turned into an internal struggle between those who wanted to flee and those who thought they could destroy Rome's power once and for all. This discrepancy in objectives and strategies divided the rebels, and Spartacus's army fractured. Meanwhile, Rome was not resting. In the Roman Senate, the leaders could not understand how a group of slaves and gladiators, men who were supposed to be the weakest, could be challenging the empire in this way. The news of Spartacus's victory spread, and fear gripped the capital. The aristocrats, feeling threatened, demanded decisive action. Rome could not allow its power to be questioned by a slave rebellion. The Senate sent legion after legion, and although Spartacus's victories were initially swift and decisive, the cost of each victory began to accumulate. His men were no longer the same. Morale began to decline, and with it, the unity that had been the force behind their success started to crack. The final blow. Rome was not going to make the same mistake of underestimating him again. For this new phase of the conflict, the Roman Senate turned to a man who would change the course of the war. Marcus Licinius Crassus, an experienced and wealthy commander, was appointed to put an end to the rebellion. Crassus was not only an experienced military man, but also someone who understood that Rome could not afford to lose to a gladiator. Crassus gathered an impressive force of over 60,000 men, well-trained and prepared to crush the rebellion. This shock force was joined by the consul Pompey, who, after being away from the fight, decided to intervene to secure the final victory. Spartacus, who had led his army to the foothills of the Alps, found himself trapped at a crossroads. Despite the internal tensions, he knew that his fate would be decided in this final confrontation. Despite his victories, Spartacus' rebellion could not continue indefinitely. The final battle was just around the corner. The last battle, in 71 BC, Spartacus and his men faced the Roman forces in a decisive battle. He knew that, although his army was large, he could not face the Roman legions in an open field. But what he could not foresee was the fury that the Roman troops would unleash that afternoon. The final battle between Spartacus and the Roman forces was a decisive confrontation. Spartacus fought until his last breath, facing the Roman soldiers with the ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose. But the number of enemies was overwhelming, and the strength of Rome was once again proven to be invincible. The gladiators and slaves who accompanied him died in the fight, and Spartacus, wounded, finally fell on the battlefield. His death marked the end of the rebellion, but the story does not end there. What ended not understand is that even though Spartacus fell, his name would live on forever. Rome crushed the rebellion, but Spartacus became a symbol, a legend, a name that would continue to inspire generations of men fighting for justice, freedom, and equality. The legacy of Spartacus throughout history. Spartacus has been seen in many ways: as a hero, as a revolutionary leader, as a man who fought for human dignity. But it is also true that his men committed crimes. The rebellion was fierce, and Spartacus, although fighting for freedom, was also caught in the violence he himself had unleashed. Spartacus left a lasting legacy, reminding us that the struggle for freedom is a constant challenge. There will always be sacrifices, there will always be obstacles, but those who dare to challenge oppression have the power to change the world. Spartacus showed that even in adverse circumstances, a leader can inspire significant change. What can we learn from Spartacus? In a world full of injustices, perhaps the real lesson is that, although the price of fighting for freedom is high, human dignity should never be negotiated. Spartacus never sought fame or glory. His only desire was to return home, but his fight for freedom transcended all of that, turning him into a timeless figure, an imperishable legacy. Today, Spartacus remains a symbol of resistance. It reminds us that the path to freedom is arduous, that the fight for justice is constant, and that although the greatest empire in the world may seem invincible, the human spirit is indomitable. Spartacus did not only fight for his freedom, he fought for a future where we all can be free. If this story has touched you, comment below what you think about Spartacus and his legacy. What do you think of his fight and his vision? And if you've been inspired, don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. Subscribe for more stories that challenge power and history.